Imagine waking up in absolute darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom with streetlights bleeding through curtains, but the kind of medieval blackness so complete you can't see your hand in front of your face. Your eyes open, or do they? You genuinely can't tell. Then you breathe out, and you hear it, a soft crackling sound. Your breath has frozen in the air above your face and fallen back onto your wool blanket as tiny ice crystals. Welcome to dawn in a medieval castle during winter where you're a knight, and you probably won't survive this day. The stone walls around you aren't just cold, they're radiating cold inward, like they're actively trying to kill you. Medieval castles were built for defence, not comfort, and that means walls 3 feet thick that trap the winter cold and refuse to release it. The temperature inside your chamber is often colder than outside, because stone holds on to freezing temperatures like a grudge. You're lying in what's essentially a tomb, and your body knows it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You try to move and every muscle screams in protest. You've been lying in the same position for hours because moving meant letting cold air into your cocoon of blankets. Your fingers are so stiff you can barely flex them. This isn't the gentle stiffness of sleeping wrong. This is your body going into conservation mode, pulling blood away from your extremities to keep your core organs functioning. You're experiencing the first stage of hypothermia, and you haven't even gotten out of bed yet. The rushes on the floor, medieval carpeting made of dried reeds and herbs, are frozen into a crunchy mat. When you finally force yourself to swing your legs over the side of your bed, your bare feet touch what feels like a sheet of ice. Because it basically is. Any moisture in the rushes has frozen solid overnight. You're standing on a floor that's maybe 2 degrees warmer than the courtyard outside, and you can feel the cold rushing up through your legs like water filling a sinking ship. Your chamber pot in the corner has frozen solid. That's right, even your urine from last night has turned to ice. This detail might seem gross, but it's actually a perfect thermometer for medieval life. When liquid waste freezes inside your bedroom, you know you're living in conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. Historians have found records of wine freezing in barrels inside castle stores, ink freezing in bottles, while scribes try to write, and yes, chamber pots shattering from ice expansion. The window just a narrow slit in the stone. No glass, because you're not wealthy enough for that. Luxury has ice formations growing inward like frozen claws reaching for you. Medieval windows were literally just holes in the wall, sometimes covered with oiled parchment or cloth, but usually just open to the elements with wooden shutters that never quite sealed properly. Wind whistles through constantly, and overnight the moisture in that wind has crystallized into elaborate ice fractals that are beautiful and deadly in equal measure. You need to get dressed, but your clothes are frozen too. Not frozen solid, but stiff with cold and whatever moisture they absorbed yesterday. Putting on a frozen linen shirt is like wrapping yourself in a corpse's embrace. The fabric is so cold it burns, and you have to force your arms through sleeves that resist every movement. This is before you even think about your armour. And here's the thing that would break most modern people immediately. This is normal. This is every single morning of winter for you. There's no central heating waiting to kick in, no hot shower to revive your frozen limbs, no thermostat to adjust. This is simply life, and you either adapt or you die. Most knights chose death, actually, though not intentionally. Winter killed more medieval soldiers than enemy armies ever did. Your squire should be here helping you dress, but he's probably frozen in his own quarters. Squires, teenage boys from noble families, learning the knight trade, often died in their sleep during harsh winters. They slept in even worse conditions than you, usually in unheated antechambers, or shared servants' quarters where body heat was the only warmth available. When a squire didn't show up for morning duties, it sometimes meant he'd simply stopped breathing in the night. You fumble in the darkness for your tinderbox hands, shaking so badly you can barely grip it. Starting a fire in these conditions is nearly impossible. The tinder is damp, your fingers won't cooperate, and even if you get a spark, it'll likely die before catching. Many knights simply gave up on candles or fires in their chambers and stumbled through morning preparations in complete darkness, which led to its own set of injuries and problems. The cathedral bell hasn't rung for Lord's, yet the pre-dawn prayer service, so you know it's still at least an hour before official sunrise. But in a medieval winter, that distinction barely matters. Daylight means grey gloom instead of black night. The sun, when it finally appears, will be a pale ghost that provides no warmth whatsoever. Your armour is hanging on its stand in the corner, and just looking at it makes you want to crawl back under your frozen blankets and accept death as the easier option. That metal has been sitting in this icebox chamber all night, which means it's reached equilibrium with the stone walls somewhere around 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. You're about to put on a full bodysuit of frozen metal, and the process will take at least an hour of pure suffering. You start with the arming doublet, a padded jacket that's supposed to protect your skin from the armour's edges and provide some cushioning against blows. Except right now it's stiff as cardboard and cold enough to make you gasp when it touches your chest. The padding, usually stuffed with wool or horsehair, has absorbed moisture from your sweat yesterday and frozen into lumpy, uncomfortable masses. It's like wearing a jacket made of ice packs, and you have to force your arms through sleeves that crackle with frost. Next come the leg harnesses, greaves for your shins, polins for your knees, cuisses for your thighs. Each piece of metal feels like it's been pulled from a frozen lake. When the steel touches your legs through the thin fabric of your hose, your muscles involuntarily spasm. Your body is screaming at you to remove this frozen metal, but you force yourself to buckle each strap with fingers that barely function. Historians still argue whether the high rates of arthritis found in knight skeletons came from combat injuries or simply from decades of putting on frozen armour every winter morning. The Sabaton's metal shoes are particular torture. Your feet are already numb from standing on the frozen rushes, and now you're encasing them in metal that conducts cold like it's the metal's primary purpose. Within seconds, you can't feel your toes at all. This isn't just discomfort. This is stage 1 frostbite beginning. Modern soldiers in extreme cold are taught to wiggle their toes constantly and change socks frequently. You're doing the opposite, sealing your feet in frozen metal prisons and preparing to wear them all day. Your squire finally stumbles in looking half dead himself. His lips are blue and he's shaking so violently he can barely hold the breastplate. Together, and it requires 2 people, you wrestle the cuirass over your head. The breastplate and backplate weigh about 25 pounds, and when that frozen metal settles onto your torso, you genuinely think your heart might stop from the shock. The cold doesn't just touch your skin. It radiates inward, pulling heat out of your core with terrifying efficiency. Here's a fun detail they don't tell you in movies: putting on armour makes you sweat even in freezing temperatures because it's incredibly strenuous work. But in winter, that sweat immediately makes everything worse. It dampens your arming doublet, which then freezes against your skin. It makes the metal slippery, so buckles and straps slip through your numb fingers. And it accelerates heat loss because wet fabric conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than dry fabric. You're essentially creating your own hypothermia conditions while trying to get dressed. The pauldron shoulder armour require your squire to rivet them in place, and his hands are shaking so badly he drops the hammer twice. When metal tools fall on stone floors in this cold, they ring with a sharp, brittle sound that echoes through the castle like a death knell. You're both moving in slow motion, your bodies refusing to cooperate, and you're not even halfway finished. The arm harnesses come next, vam braces for forearms, couters for elbows, re-rib braces for upper arms. Each piece is a fresh assault of cold metal against skin that's already losing sensation. Your squire has to buckle the straps because your fingers have stopped working properly. The fine motor control required for buckles and laces is one of the first things you lose in extreme cold, which is why so many knights had squires in the first place. A knight who couldn't afford a squire often couldn't get into his armour alone, especially in winter. Now for the gauntlets, arguably the worst part. Your hands are already borderline frostbitten and you're about to encase them in articulated metal gloves that have been sitting in sub-zero temperatures all night. The moment the gauntlets slide on pain and shoots up your arms, it's not just cold, it's burning, stinging, aching pain as the frozen metal touches every finger simultaneously. You flex your hands experimentally, and the metal joints creak with a sound like breaking ice. Some knights tried padding their gauntlets with extra cloth in winter, but that created a different problem-reduced dexterity. A gauntlet that's too padded means you can't grip your sword properly, can't feel your reins, can't perform the 100 small tasks that keep you alive in combat. So most knights chose frostbite over clumsiness, which tells you everything about medieval priorities. The gorget throat armour goes on next, and this piece is particularly miserable because it sits directly against the major blood vessels in your neck. You can actually feel your pulse slowing as the cold metal constricts around your throat, your body trying desperately to conserve heat. Some knights in winter wore additional scarves or wraps under their gorgets, but this created weak points in their armour. Choose between freezing or vulnerability, medieval life was full of these wonderful options. Finally, the helmet. The great helm or bassinet you'll wear weighs another 5 to 7 pounds, and it's been sitting in this frozen chamber all night like everything else. When you lower it onto your head, the metal presses against your skull with a cold so intense it causes an immediate headache. The padding inside meant to cushion blows is frozen stiff and provides no comfort whatsoever. Your breath inside the helmet immediately starts fogging the visor, and that fog freezes into ice crystals that obscure your already limited vision. You're fully armoured now, which means you're wearing approximately 60 pounds of frozen metal, and your body has already burned through a tremendous amount of energy just getting dressed. In modern terms, you've completed the equivalent of a moderate workout before your day has even begun. Your muscles are shaking, your core temperature has dropped, and you haven't eaten anything yet. Speaking of which, it's time for breakfast, and you're going to hate it. The Great Hall is marginally warmer than your chamber, but only because of the sheer number of bodies packed inside. Knights, men-at-arms, servants, and various castle residents huddle together on benches, their breath creating a collective fog that hangs in the air like a low cloud. The massive fireplace at one end of the hall has a fire burning, but here's the thing about medieval fireplaces: they heat about 5 feet in front of them and nowhere else. If you're not sitting directly in front of the flames, you might as well be outside. The trestle tables are laid with breakfast, and it's exactly as disappointing as you feared. No eggs. Chickens stop laying in winter, and any eggs that do appear are so valuable they're reserved for the Lord's table or sold. No bacon sizzling on a griddle. No hot oatmeal steaming in bowls. No coffee, because that won't reach Europe for another few centuries. Instead, you get pottage. Pottage is a thick stew that was made yesterday or possibly the day before, kept in a pot by the fire, and has now cooled to a gelatinous, lukewarm mass. It's made from whatever vegetables didn't rot in storage, usually turnips, onions, and cabbage, with maybe some barley or oats to thicken it. If you're lucky, there might be a bone floating in there that was boiled so many times it's basically rubber. The pottage has a layer of congealed fat on top, which is actually the most valuable part because fat equals calories, and you're going to need every calorie you can get. You eat it with a wooden spoon sitting in your armour, which makes the simple act of bringing food to your mouth a complicated operation. The armour restricts your movement and your gauntleted hands can barely grip the spoon. Many knights removed their gauntlets to eat, but that meant exposing already damaged hands to more cold. Your choice: eat clumsily in full armour, or risk further frostbite. Choose wisely. The bread on the table is trencher, bread, thick, hard, stale slices that serve as edible plates. It's not meant to be delicious. It's meant to soak up your pottage and provide bulk. By winter, the bread is made from last year's grain, which might have mould weevils or both. You don't look too closely. You just eat, because refusing food in winter is suicide. Historians have found records of knights losing 20 to 30 pounds during winter campaigns, their bodies literally consuming themselves to stay warm. To drink, you get ale, not the craft beer you'd enjoy at a modern pub, but weak, slightly sour ale that's basically liquid bread. It's served cold because nobody is heating beverages except for the Lord, and even this ale has ice crystals floating in it. The alcohol content is low, maybe 2 or 3%, so it won't warm you up, but it's safer than water, which might be contaminated. You drink, and the cold liquid makes your stomach cramp. Here's something that would shock modern people. There's almost no conversation during this meal. Everyone is too cold, too tired, too focused on getting calories into their bodies. The only sounds are spoons scraping bowls, jaws working on hard bread, and the occasional cough or sniffle. Winter colds swept through medieval castles like wildfire, and in your weakened, frozen state, a simple cold could develop into pneumonia that kills you within days. Some castles tried to serve hot food in winter by keeping cauldrons constantly over the fire, but this created its own problems. The servants who tended these cauldrons often suffered severe burns from the flames, or worse, carbon monoxide poisoning from the poorly ventilated kitchens. Medieval records mention servants found dead near cooking fires, and while some deaths were attributed to falling asleep too close to the flames, many were likely poisoning that we now understand but they couldn't explain. You notice several empty spaces at the tables, knights and soldiers who didn't make it through the night. Nobody mentions them. Bodies freeze solid in winter, making burial impossible, because the ground is frozen several feet deep. The dead are usually stored in unheated outbuildings until spring thaw, stacked like cordwood. This casual relationship with death would horrify modern sensibilities, but in medieval winter, death was such a constant companion that mourning every loss would paralyze the living. After breakfast, and we're using that term generously, you're supposed to feel energized and ready for the day. Instead, you feel slightly less starving than before. The pottage sits heavy in your stomach, the ale sloshes uncomfortably, and you're still wearing 60 pounds of frozen metal that has now absorbed your body heat and is slowly pulling it away. You've been awake for maybe 2 hours and you're already exhausted. Some nights supplemented their diet with whatever they could hunt or forage, but winter hunting was notoriously difficult. Game was scarce, and tracking animals in deep snow while wearing armour was nearly impossible. Plus, any meat you did manage to kill would freeze solid within hours, and thawing it without a good fire meant eating semi-frozen venison that could crack your teeth. The really wealthy knights we're talking, landed nobility with significant income, might have access to preserved foods, like salted fish, smoked meat, or dried fruits. But most knights were essentially military professionals living on salary, and their diet in winter was subsistence level at best. There's a reason medieval people celebrated the return of spring with such fervour. They'd spent months slowly starving in the cold. You stand up from the table, your armour creaking your stomach, minimally satisfied, your body screaming for more food that won't come. The day stretches ahead of you like a frozen wasteland, and you haven't even stepped outside yet. Now you have to get on your horse, and this is where things go from miserable to potentially fatal. Your destrier, the warhorse you've trained with for years, is waiting in the stable, and the moment you enter that building you realise the horse might actually be worse off than you are. At least you got to sleep inside stone walls. Your horse spent the night in a wooden structure with gaps in the walls, standing on frozen straw with no blanket, because horse blankets won't become common for another few centuries. The destrier looks at you with enormous brown eyes that seem to ask, "Why are you doing this to both of us?" Its breath comes out in great plumes of steam, and you can see it shivering despite its winter coat. Horses, despite their size, are surprisingly vulnerable to cold. Their large body mass helps, but their legs, thin and poorly insulated, suffer badly in freezing temperatures. Your horse's legs are already showing signs of cold stress, the joints are stiff, and it shifts weight constantly trying to keep blood flowing to its hooves. Speaking of hooves, they're cracked. Winter dries out hooves like it dries out everything else, and cracked hooves on frozen ground means every step is potentially damaging. Medieval farriers did their best, but horseshoes in winter were a double-edged sword. They protected hooves but also conducted cold directly into the sensitive tissue. Ice balls formed between the shoe and hoof, causing lameness. Many horses simply went lame every winter, and a lame war horse was worthless, which meant your entire livelihood could vanish because of ice. Your squire brings the saddle, and here's another detail that ruins the romantic image of knighthood. Saddles in winter are frozen solid. The leather is stiff as wood, and the stirrups are metal that's been sitting in an unheated stable all night. Putting that saddle on your horse requires wrestling with rigid leather, while your horse dances nervously, its hooves slipping on ice-covered stable floors. Medieval records mention numerous injuries from horses falling in stables, broken legs for the horses, crushed limbs for the humans nearby. Getting onto the horse while wearing 60 pounds of armour in the best conditions requires assistance. In winter, it requires a small miracle. Your squire has to help hoist you up. There's no dignity here, just pure mechanical effort. And when you finally settle into that frozen saddle, your legs already encased in frozen metal are now pressed against frozen leather. The cold attacks from every angle, and you haven't even left the stable yet. The horse needs to be fed, but winter feed is scarce and low quality. Hay from last summer has lost most of its nutritional value, and grain is expensive and carefully rationed. Your destrier is probably eating half of what it needs, which means it's slowly starving just like you. A warhorse requires enormous amounts of food to maintain its muscle mass and energy. We're talking 20 to 30 pounds of feed per day. In winter, many warhorses got 10 pounds if they were lucky. Do the math, that's an animal slowly consuming its own body to survive just like its rider. The stable master mentions that 2 horses died last night. Just died standing in their stalls, frozen from the inside out. Horses can't shiver as efficiently as humans, and once their core temperature drops below a certain point, they simply shut down. These weren't old or sick horses. They were trained war horses worth more than most peasants would earn in 5 years, and they died because it was cold. The stable master says this information without emotion, because emotional investment in animals that die regularly is a luxury nobody can afford. You guide your horse out of the stable and into the courtyard, and immediately everything gets worse. The courtyard is covered in a layer of ice that makes every step treacherous. Your horse's hooves slip and slide, and you can feel the animal tensing beneath you, terrified of falling. A horse that falls while carrying an armoured rider can break bones, and a horse with a broken leg is a dead horse. There's no equine surgery, no recovery period, just a swift death to end the suffering. The roads beyond the castle are even more dangerous. Medieval roads were barely maintained in summer and completely abandoned in winter. Snow covers potholes, ice conceals ditches, and frozen ruts from autumn wagon wheels create a surface designed to break your horse's legs. You're supposed to patrol these roads, to ride circuits around the castle's territory, to show the peasants that the lord's authority is present, but every step your horse takes could be its last. Here's something historians still debate: how many knights actually died from horse-related accidents versus combat. The numbers suggest that more knights were killed or permanently disabled by falling horses than by enemy weapons. A fall from a moving horse while wearing full armor means hitting the ground with tremendous force, and that armor that's supposed to protect you becomes a death trap. You can't get up on your own. If you land face down in snow, you can suffocate. If you land on frozen ground, you can crack your skull inside your helmet. If your horse falls on you, and panicked horses often do, you're crushed. Your horse stumbles, catches itself, and your heart pounds so hard you can hear it inside your helmet. That stumble could have been the end. One slip, one patch of ice, one frozen puddle, disguised by snow, and you're both dead or dying. You pat the horse's neck, feeling the animal's fear through your gauntlets, and you keep riding, because stopping isn't an option. The wind picks up and your horse lowers its head against the blast. You're both moving targets for the cold now, the wind cutting through every gap in your armor and penetrating your horse's winter coat. The animal's ears are pinned back, a sign of distress, and you feel its stride shorten as it tries to conserve energy. You're not even doing anything yet, no combat, no action, and you're both already at your limits. Let's talk about what you're actually carrying right now, because the numbers are genuinely staggering and would break most modern people within an hour. Your full plate armor weighs approximately 60 pounds. That's the breastplate, backplate, pauldrons, vambraces, gauntlets, greaves, sabatons, gorget and helmet all combined. 60 pounds of metal distributed across your body, and while weight distribution helps, it's still 60 pounds that you're hauling around every moment of the day. But wait, there's more. Because it's winter, you're also wearing layers underneath the armor. Your linen shirt, your wool hose, your arming doublet with its padding, and probably an additional wool tunic because you're desperately trying not to freeze to death. Add another 10 to 15 pounds for all that fabric. Then there's your sword, 3 to 4 pounds, your dagger, 1 to 2 pounds. Your shield, if you're carrying one, which you probably are, another 7 to 10 pounds depending on the type. We're now at roughly 80 to 85 pounds of gear on your body. That's like carrying a full-grown German shepherd on your back all day, except the weight is distributed in a way that restricts your movement and makes every action require extra effort. Walking in this gear burns approximately twice the calories as walking normally. Climbing stairs, 3 times the effort. Fighting. We're talking extreme exertion levels that would exhaust an Olympic athlete. And here's the part that really makes this impossible for modern humans. You're wearing this while malnourished, sleep-deprived and suffering from the early stages of hypothermia. Your body's already operating in emergency mode, pulling resources from non-essential functions to keep your core warm, and now you're asking it to haul 85 pounds of weight through snow and ice. It's like trying to run a marathon while simultaneously fighting off the flu. The armor itself becomes a heat management nightmare in winter. Yes, metal conducts heat, which in summer makes armor unbearably hot. But in winter, that same thermal conductivity works in reverse. The metal pulls heat away from your body at a terrifying rate. Every bit of metal touching your skin through the fabric is a little heat vampire sucking warmth out of you and radiating it into the frozen air. Scientists have done experiments showing that metal in extreme cold can lower skin temperature by 10 to 15 degrees within minutes of contact. Your mobility is severely compromised. Plate armor, even well-fitted armor, restricts your range of motion significantly. You can't raise your arms fully overhead. You can't bend at the waist easily. You can't turn your head without turning your entire upper body. Now add frozen joints, both the armor's joints and your body's joints, and you're moving like a rusty robot. Every motion requires conscious effort and extra energy expenditure. Falling down is a death sentence. If you slip on ice and fall, you're essentially a turtle on its back. The weight and restriction of the armor mean you physically cannot get up without assistance. Medieval training included practice in getting up from the ground in armor, but that was in controlled conditions with help nearby. Out on a winter patrol alone on a frozen road, a simple fall means you lie there until someone finds you, or you freeze to death. Historians have found records of knights discovered frozen solid on the ground, apparently having fallen and been unable to rise. The psychological weight is almost worse than the physical. You're constantly aware that this armor which is supposed to protect you could also kill you. You're one fall away from helplessness, one river crossing away from drowning knights in full armor, who fell into water, just sank and died one equipment failure away from exposure. The armor makes you powerful and vulnerable simultaneously, and that mental stress compounds the physical exhaustion. Some knights tried to reduce weight in winter by wearing less armor, but that created new problems. Leave off your leg armor, and your legs are vulnerable to enemy attacks. Skip the gauntlets for better dexterity, and your hands freeze and become useless anyway. Medieval warfare was brutal about exploiting any weakness and enemy-specifically targeted gaps in armor. So most knights chose to wear full harness and just suffer, because suffering was better than dying. Your horse is carrying even more weight than you realize. A destrier, a war horse bred for carrying armoured knights, weighs between 1,400 and 2,000 pounds. The saddle and tack add another 30 to 40 pounds. You and your armour weigh perhaps 250 pounds total. The horse is carrying roughly 15% of its body weight, which is approaching the maximum recommended load. And it's doing this while malnourished, potentially lame on treacherous footing, in conditions that make every step dangerous. The combination of weight and cold creates a feedback loop of exhaustion. The weight makes you exert more energy, which generates heat, which makes you sweat, which dampens your underlayers, which conducts heat away from your body faster, which makes you colder, which makes your muscles work less efficiently, which means you need even more energy to move the weight. It's a death spiral, and every knight in winter was caught in it to some degree. Modern soldiers carrying heavy loads, special forces infantry with full packs train for months to build the specific strength and endurance needed. They have proper nutrition, rest, and conditioning programs. You have none of that. You're essentially being asked to perform at elite levels, while your body is already failing from cold and malnutrition. The fact that any medieval knight survived winter at all is testament to human stubbornness more than any reasonable expectation of success. Training doesn't stop for winter, which is one of those facts that seems designed to maximize human suffering. You're expected to maintain combat readiness year-round, which means morning drills in the bailey, the castle's inner courtyard, regardless of temperature. So here you are in full armour, holding a sword that weighs 3.5 pounds, but feels like 30, expected to practice strikes and parries, while your body screams for you to stop. The bailey is a wind tunnel. Castle design, brilliant for defence, creates these enclosed spaces where wind whips around in circles, concentrating the cold rather than dispersing it. The tall stone walls block any potential sunlight, keeping the courtyard in perpetual shadow. Snow accumulates in corners, and along walls, never melting, building up in drifts that reduce the usable training space. The ground is a mixture of frozen mud ice and scattered straw that provides almost no traction. Your training master, usually an older knight or experienced man-at-arms, is shouting instructions, but his voice is muffled by wind and by your helmet. You can barely hear him, and what you do hear makes no sense because your brain is too cold to process complex instructions. Cognitive function declines rapidly in extreme cold. Studies have shown that mental processing slows by 20 to 30% when core body temperature drops just a few degrees. You're trying to remember sword forms while your brain is shutting down non-essential functions. The sword itself is a torture device in winter. The grip, usually wrapped in leather or cord, is frozen solid. Your gauntleted hands can barely feel the weapon, and what little sensation you have tells you that your fingers are freezing to the metal pommel. When you swing, the cold has made the metal brittle, not enough to shatter, but enough to change how the blade responds. The balance feels off. The weight distribution seems wrong. You're working with a weapon that doesn't behave the way it should. Sparring with training weapons, blunted swords or wooden wasters is mandatory, and this is where people actually die. Not from the practice weapons themselves, but from what happens when cold meets exertion. Your sparring partner comes at you with a downward strike, you raise your sword to block, and the impact reverberates through your frozen hands up into your frozen arms. The shock is magnified because your muscles are stiff and slow to respond. You stumble backward, slip on ice, and catch yourself barely. But your sparring partner isn't as lucky. He overextends on his next strike, his frozen legs can't adjust quickly enough, and he goes down hard. The crash of metal on frozen stone echoes across the bailey. He's on his back, arms and legs, flailing uselessly, unable to get up. 2 squires rush over to help him rise, and you see his face when they remove his helmet, blue-tinged lips, eyes unfocused, breathing shallow and rapid. He's hypothermic, pushed over the edge by the exertion and fall. They carry him inside, and training continues because it always continues. The training master doesn't acknowledge what just happened except to shout at everyone to maintain better footing. This is normal. Nights incapacitated by cold during training is so common it barely registers as noteworthy. Some recover after warming by a fire and drinking hot wine if there's hot wine available, which there often isn't. Others slip into deeper hypothermia and die overnight, their hearts simply stopping when their core temperature drops too low. Here's something modern people don't appreciate. The skill gap between summer and winter combat was enormous. A knight who was competent in summer became clumsy and dangerous to himself in winter. Reaction times slowed. Coordination suffered, strength diminished. Medieval combat manuals, yes, they existed, make almost no mention of winter adaptations because the reality was you just fought worse and hoped your enemy was equally impaired. Historians still debate whether winter battles had higher casualties from combat or from exposure afterward. The training exercises are simplified in winter because complex maneuvers are impossible. You're drilling basic strikes, basic blocks, basic footwork. Over and over the same movements, trying to maintain muscle memory when your muscles are barely functioning. Your breath inside your helmet has created a layer of ice on the inside of your visor, partially obscuring your vision. You can't see, clearly can't move, properly can't think straight. But you keep practicing because the alternative is being unprepared when real combat comes. And real combat does come even in winter. Enemy raids, bandit attacks, peasant uprisings. Violence doesn't observe a seasonal schedule. So you train despite every indication that this training is more likely to kill you than help you. The sword feels like an extension of your frozen arm, heavy and unwieldy. You practice a diagonal cut and your shoulder protests with sharp pain. The cold has inflamed the old injury from last year's tournament, and the inflammation is now chronic pain that won't fade until spring. Other knights in the bailey are struggling similarly. You see one man simply stop moving, standing motionless with his sword lowered, staring at nothing. The training master has to physically shake him to get a response. Another knight is coughing so violently he has to remove his helmet and spit blood onto the snow, probably pneumonia developing which will kill him within a week if he's unlucky. Training in winter isn't preparing you for combat, it's just a different form of combat where the enemy is the environment itself. Your practice session is supposed to last 2 hours. Most days in winter it's cut short after 1 hour because too many participants are incapacitated. Today you make it 90 minutes before the training master finally calls a halt. You've accomplished nothing except exhausting yourself, further damaging your body more and maintaining the fiction that you're a combat-ready knight. You can barely walk back to the hall, your legs cramping from cold and exertion, your arms hanging useless at your sides. Now let's address something that historical documentaries conveniently ignore. You need to use the bathroom, and this might actually be the worst part of your day. Medieval castle latrines in winter are not just uncomfortable, they're legitimately dangerous, and knights have died using them. Not a joke, not an exaggeration, dead from going to the bathroom. The latrine is located in a small stone alcove built into the castle wall, usually accessible through a narrow corridor that somehow manages to be even colder than the rest of the castle. It's called a garderobe, which sounds fancy until you realise it literally means guard the robe, a polite term for the place where you guard your clothing while defecating. The design is simple, a stone seat with a hole cut through it, and below that hole is a shaft that drops anywhere from 20 to 60 feet, down to either a cesspit, a moat, or just the outside castle wall, where waste accumulates in a frozen pile. Getting to this latrine while wearing 80 pounds of armour is a complex operation requiring your squire's assistance. You can't simply go while armoured. The armour has to be partially removed, which means unbuckling your leg armour, at minimum possibly removing your cuisses entirely, definitely removing your sabatons. Your squire helps with this process in the freezing corridor, both of you working with numb fingers on frozen buckles that don't want to cooperate. Now you're standing in a stone alcove in partial armour, about to expose the most vulnerable parts of your body to sub-zero temperatures. The stone seat is coated with frost. Not dampness, not condensation. Actual frost crystals have formed on the stone where countless people have sat. When you lower yourself onto that seat, the cold against your bare skin is so shocking that your body involuntarily clenches, which is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish. The hole in the seat is perhaps 8 to 12 inches in diameter, and when you look down, which you shouldn't but everyone does, you can see down the shaft. In winter you can see ice formations on the shaft walls, frozen waste from previous users, creating bizarre stalactites of filth. The smell is oddly muted because the cold has frozen most of the bacteria that create odour, but what smell remains is sharp and acidic, concentrated by the confined space. Here's where it gets dangerous. The cold on your exposed skin isn't just uncomfortable, it's causing immediate tissue damage. Your buttocks, thighs and genitals are experiencing frostbite within seconds of exposure. Blood vessels constrict, skin temperature plummets, and you're literally freezing the most sensitive parts of your body. Medieval medical texts mention disorders of the fundament brought on by winter's bite, which is a fancy way of saying frostbite of the anus and surrounding tissue. This condition caused infections, abscesses, and occasionally death from sepsis. The process you're trying to complete, basic defecation, becomes extremely difficult when your body is this cold. Your muscles don't work properly. Your digestive system has slowed to conserve energy. You're likely constipated from the low-fibre medieval diet and dehydration from cold weather. You sit there, freezing, straining, accomplishing nothing while your squire waits outside in the corridor, because even basic dignity demands he not watch this humiliation. Some men fell asleep on the latrine. The combination of exhaustion, the strain of trying to defecate, and the enclosed space with minimal air circulation created conditions for passing out. And if you pass out while sitting on a latrine in full winter, you can die from exposure before anyone finds you. Records exist of servants finding nobles frozen to death in guardrobes, their bodies locked in position, having lost consciousness and never woken up. Others faced a different danger. The shaft below was sometimes coated in ice, making it slippery, and the hole in the seat was larger than safety would dictate. People, especially children or smaller adults, occasionally fell through. Falling down a latrine shaft meant landing in a pit of frozen waste, often suffering broken bones from the fall, and then facing the challenge of climbing out of a smooth-walled shaft while covered in filth. Some never made it out. There are medieval records of bodies recovered from cesspit shafts, and while some fell accidentally, historians still debate how many were pushed. You finally managed to complete the basic biological function, and now comes the cleaning process. Toilet paper doesn't exist. Instead, there's a bucket of hay straw or wool scraps that have been sitting in this frozen alcove and are themselves frozen stiff. You use these frozen materials to clean yourself, which is about as pleasant as it sounds, basically scraping yourself with frozen plant matter or fabric. Some wealthy individuals use moss or soft cloth, but in winter, everything is frozen solid regardless of its original texture. Reclothing yourself requires your squire's help again, and your exposed skin is now damaged from cold exposure. You can feel the burning sensation that indicates frostbite, and you know from experience that this area will be painful for days, possibly developing chilblains, itchy. Painful swelling caused by repeated cold exposure. Medieval people just lived with this constant low-level tissue damage all winter long. The whole ordeal has taken perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, during which you've expended significant energy, caused damage to your body, and you've accomplished the basic biological function that modern humans complete multiple times daily without a second thought. You walk back through the freezing corridor re-armoured, exhausted from something as simple as using the bathroom, and you'll have to do this again later today, and tomorrow, and every day until spring. Knights sometimes avoided drinking liquids to reduce bathroom trips, which led to dehydration, which worsened all the other cold weather problems. Choose between damaging your body from cold exposure during bathroom visits, or damaging your body through dehydration, another one of those wonderful medieval choices. You might think that being inside a castle means you're sheltered from the wind, but medieval castle design had other ideas. These fortresses were built for military defence, not comfort, and one of the unintended consequences is that castles become wind amplifiers in winter. The very features that make them defensible, narrow corridors, multiple courtyards, tall walls with battlements, turn them into architectural nightmares when cold wind starts blowing. The phenomenon is called the Venturi effect. Though medieval people didn't have a name for it, they just knew that winds somehow got worse inside the castle than outside. When wind hits the castle's exterior walls, it's forced through narrow gaps, gatehouses and arrow slits, and basic physics says that when you force air through a smaller space, it speeds up. So a moderate wind outside becomes a howling gale inside the corridors, and there's absolutely nowhere to hide from it. The main corridor connecting the Great Hall to the residential towers is a perfect wind tunnel. It's perhaps 6 feet wide, 30 feet long, with stone walls on both sides and no doors. Wind enters from the courtyard at one end, accelerates through the narrow space and exits through arrow slits and gaps in the far wall. Walking through this corridor means leaning forward at a 45-degree angle, fighting against wind strong enough to stagger you, in armour, while already exhausted. The wind chill factor, a concept that won't be mathematically defined until the 1940s, but which medieval people experienced intimately, makes the effective temperature far colder than the actual air temperature. An air temperature of 20 degrees Fahrenheit with a 20-mile-per-hour wind creates a wind chill of around 4 degrees. Inside these corridor wind tunnels, with wind speeds potentially reaching 30 or 40 miles per hour, the wind chill can drop to negative numbers even when the actual temperature is above freezing. Your face, the only part of you potentially exposed when you lift your visor to see better, feels like it's being flayed by invisible knives. The wind is so cold it makes your eyes water immediately, and those tears freeze on your cheeks. Your nose runs constantly, and that mucus freezes into uncomfortable crystals. Breathing the wind-driven cold air makes your lungs ache. Each breath is like inhaling broken glass, and chronic coughing becomes universal among castle residents in winter. The arrow slits those narrow vertical openings designed to let archers shoot out, while limiting incoming arrows become frozen torture devices. They're unglazed openings in 3-foot thick walls, and wind pours through them like water through a fire hose. Standing near an arrow slit means being blasted by concentrated wind, and the stone around these openings is coated in frost from the moisture in the air freezing on contact. Tapestries hung on walls near arrow slits literally freeze to the stone, creating bizarre ice sculptures of fabric. The spiral staircases are even worse. Medieval castle staircases spiral upward in tight stone cylinders, usually clockwise to give defending swordsmen an advantage. But they also create vertical wind channels where cold air sinks and warm air rises, creating circular air currents that never stop moving. Climbing these staircases in winter means fighting upward against a constant downward blast of freezing air. Your legs already burning from armor weight, now also fighting wind resistance, and you're gasping for breath in air so cold it hurts to inhale. The Great Hall, which you might expect to be warmer, has its own wind problems. The high ceiling, sometimes 30 or 40 feet above the floor, creates a massive vertical space where heat rises and cold air sinks. The fire burning in the hearth heats the air. That heated air rises to the ceiling and does nothing useful for the people below, while cold air from gaps in the walls and doors flows in at floor level. You're sitting in a conveyor belt of cold air constantly replaced by more cold air, with all the heat escaping uselessly above your head. Historians still argue about why medieval builders didn't design for warmth, but the answer is probably simple. Military needs trumped comfort every time. A warm-sealed castle is also a castle that can be smoked out during siege, that has fewer observation points, that's harder to defend. So everyone just accepted freezing as the price of safety, and they tried to cope with tapestries, braziers, and sheer stubbornness. Some castles attempted to block wind with wooden screens or heavy curtains hung across corridors, but these created fire hazards and reduced the ability to move quickly during emergencies. Plus, in winter, any fabric hung in corridors quickly became coated with ice from the moisture in people's breath, turning into stiff, crackling barriers that were almost useless. The fabric would literally freeze solid, hanging like wooden boards rather than flexible cloth. The battlements, the top of the castle walls where guards keep watch, are exposed to the full force of winter wind with no shelter whatsoever. Guards up there are essentially standing on a stone platform hundreds of feet above the ground in full wind, often in snow or sleet for hours at a time. We'll talk more about guard duty later, but just know that the wind on the battlements is strong enough to knock men off the walls, and it happened regularly. Even your personal chamber, which you might think of as a refuge, isn't safe from wind. The door doesn't seal properly, medieval carpentry couldn't create airtight seals, and even if it could, you'd suffocate without air circulation. Wind seeps under the door through the keyhole around the frame. Your window, even with shutters closed, leaks wine through every gap. You can feel air moving across your face while lying in bed, and sometimes the wind is strong enough to extinguish candles even inside closed rooms. Midday patrol is a mandatory duty, and it's exactly as miserable as everything else. You're mounted on your half-starved, potentially lame horse, riding the perimeter of the castle's territory, in conditions that would make modern search and rescue teams turn around and go home. The patrol route is typically a circuit of several miles checking on outlying farms, guard posts and potential approach routes that enemies might use. In summer, this takes maybe 2 hours. In winter, it becomes a death march that might last 4 or 5 hours if you even complete it at all. The snow is deep enough that your horse is breaking through the crust with every step, which means every step requires extra effort. The horse is already exhausted from malnutrition, and now it's essentially doing high knee exercises through 2 feet of snow while carrying your armoured weight. You can feel the animal's energy draining with each stride, its breath coming in harsh gasps, its pace slowing steadily. Horses can die from exertion in cold weather. Their bodies overheat from effort, they sweat, and then that sweat freezes, creating a feedback loop that kills them. Your job is to maintain vigilance, to watch for threats, to observe everything. But your eyelids are freezing shut. This isn't a metaphor or exaggeration. The moisture in your eyes and on your lashes is literally freezing, creating ice crystals that make your eyelids stick together when you blink. You have to manually wipe your eyes, constantly dragging your gauntleted hand across your face, which risks damaging your eyes with the metal, but is necessary to maintain any vision at all. The landscape is a monochrome nightmare. Snow covers everything, creating a white blanket that eliminates depth perception and hides every danger. That innocent-looking flat area ahead might be a snowdrift concealing a 10-foot drop. That slight depression could be a frozen stream with ice, too thin to support your horse's weight. Everything looks the same and navigation becomes guesswork. Medieval people didn't have GPS, or even reliable maps you're navigating by memory and landmarks that are now buried under snow. You're supposed to be checking on the local farms, ensuring the peasants are still alive and paying attention to potential threats. But when you reach the first farmstead, you find it completely snowed in. The thatched roof is sagging under snow-weight, smoke is barely trickling from the smoke hole, and nobody comes out to greet you. Either they're all huddling inside for warmth, or they're dead. You don't have time or energy to check, so you mark it on your mental list and keep moving. Several farms will be discovered in spring with entire families frozen inside, but that's a spring problem. The guard posts are small stone towers at strategic points around the territory, usually manned by 2 or 3 soldiers. These posts are supposed to provide early warning of enemy movements, but in winter they become tombs. You approach the first tower and see no signs of life, no smoke from their fire, no movement in the window. You call out and there's no response. This tower's garrison is probably dead frozen during the night, but investigating means dismounting and climbing stairs in full armour, and you're barely staying on your horse as it is. Halfway through the patrol route, you encounter another mounted patrol coming from the opposite direction. They look as miserable as you feel hunched in their saddles, ice coating their armour, their horses stumbling with exhaustion. You exchange minimal information. Nothing to report means we're all still alive, but barely. No enemy sightings, no unusual activity, no problems except the constant problem of trying not to die from cold. The other patrol continues on, and you wonder if you'll see them again or if they'll be found frozen somewhere along their route. Your hands have lost all sensation. You're holding the reins, but you can't actually feel them. You know you're gripping something, because you can see your hands in front of you. But the sensory connection between your brain and your fingers has been severed by cold. This is extremely dangerous, because you can't adjust your grip, can't respond to your horse's movements properly, and if something startles the horse, you won't be able to hold on. Knights fell from horses in winter simply because their frozen hands couldn't maintain grip. The horse stumbles badly, nearly goes down, catches itself at the last second. Your heart pounds because you know what that stumble means. The horse is reaching its limit. If it falls now, you're both finished. You're miles from the castle in deep snow with no help available. A fallen horse can't get back up in these conditions, and you can't walk back carrying 80 pounds of armour through snow. You'd have to abandon the horse, worth more than most people earn in a year, and try to make it back on foot, which likely means you die before reaching safety. But you keep going because turning back early means admitting failure, and medieval military culture didn't tolerate failure. A knight who couldn't complete his patrol duty was considered unreliable, which damaged your reputation, which affected your ability to find employment, which ultimately meant poverty and death. So you push forward, your body screaming, your horse dying beneath you, because the alternative is social and economic ruin. You're supposed to be watching for enemy activity, but you can barely keep your eyes open. Your brain is foggy from cold and exhaustion, your cognitive function reduced to basic survival processing. An enemy army could be marching 50 yards away and you might not notice through the snow in your impaired mental state. The patrol is theatre, a ritual performed to maintain the illusion of security, but in reality winter makes defence nearly impossible. because the defenders are as incapacitated as any potential attackers. Let's talk about frostbite, because by this point in your day, you definitely have it, and understanding what's happening to your body makes the situation even more horrifying. Frostbite is your body's brutal calculus sacrifice the extremities to save the core. Your fingers, toes, nose, and ears are being abandoned like lifeboats thrown overboard, and the worst part is, you won't know how bad it is until hours or even days later. The process begins with vasoconstriction. Your blood vessels in extremities narrow to reduce heat loss. This is actually a smart survival mechanism, but it means your fingers and toes are receiving minimal blood flow. Without blood flow, tissue temperature drops. When tissue temperature falls below about 50 degrees, Fahrenheit ice crystals begin forming inside your cells. These crystals are sharp, jagged structures that puncture cell membranes from the inside, essentially shredding your tissue at the microscopic level. You can't feel this happening. That's the insidious part. The early stage of frostbite involves numbness. Your nerves stop sending pain signals because they're too cold to function, so your fingers feel nothing, which seems like a relief compared to the earlier burning pain, but nothing is actually much worse. Nothing means your tissue is dying and you're unaware of it. Medieval people called this dead flesh and recognized it as a serious problem, but they had no understanding of the cellular damage occurring. There are 3 stages of frostbite, though medieval people didn't classify them this way. First-degree ice crystals form in the skin surface, causing numbness and white or greyish-yellow patches. This is reversible if you rewarm slowly. Second-degree ice penetrates deeper. Blisters form, and tissue damage is more severe. You'll lose some skin, but probably keep the digit. Third-degree ice reaches bone tissue, dies completely, and amputation becomes necessary. You're probably at stage 2 in your fingers right now, stage 1 in your toes, because boots provide slightly more insulation than gauntlets. The real damage happens during rewarming, which sounds backward, but it's true. When frozen tissue thaws, blood rushes back into damaged vessels, causing inflammation, swelling, and intense pain. The pain is described by modern frostbite victims as worse than anything they've experienced: burning, stabbing, throbbing agony that makes grown adults scream. Medieval people didn't understand this mechanism. They just knew that warming frozen flesh hurt worse than the initial freezing, which led to some truly terrible treatment decisions. Medieval medical treatment for frostbite was spectacularly bad. Physicians believed in the theory of humours, the idea that health depended on balancing 4 body fluids. Frostbite was considered an excess of cold and moist humours, so treatment involved heating the affected area as quickly as possible, often by plunging frozen hands directly into boiling water or holding them over open flames. This catastrophic approach caused additional tissue damage, burned already, compromised skin, and often forced amputation of digits that might have been saved with gentler rewarming. Some physicians advocated rubbing frozen flesh with snow or ice, believing that gradual cold-to-cold treatment was gentler. This was actually closer to correct. Modern frostbite treatment involves slow rewarming, but the medieval execution was still problematic because they often rubbed too vigorously, causing mechanical damage to frozen tissue. Imagine rubbing sandpaper on flesh that's already been shredded by ice crystals at the cellular level. Amputation was common, and medieval surgical techniques made it a horrifying prospect. No anesthesia except alcohol and maybe some opium if you were wealthy and lucky. The surgeon would cut through frozen flesh and bone with a saw, cauterize the stump with a red-hot iron, and hope infection didn't set in. Survival rate for winter amputations was perhaps 50% at best, because the patient's body was already compromised by cold malnutrition and exhaustion. Many knights who lost fingers or toes to frostbite later died from infections that developed at the amputation site. Here's something historians still debate: how many medieval people lived with chronic frostbite damage. Modern research in cold weather populations shows that repeated frostbite causes permanent nerve damage, reduced circulation, and increased susceptibility to future cold injury. A knight who got frostbite one winter would be more vulnerable every subsequent winter, creating a downward spiral. Some medieval skeletons show evidence of multiple amputations over a lifetime, losing fingers progressively winter after winter. The psychological impact of watching your own flesh die is devastating. You look at your fingers, pale, waxy, unresponsive, and know they might be gone. Medieval people were intimately familiar with death, but there's something uniquely disturbing about your body dying piece by piece while you're still alive. Some knights became obsessed with checking their extremities, constantly removing gauntlets dozens of times per day to inspect their fingers, which actually worsened frostbite by exposing skin to repeated temperature changes. Your toes are probably worse off than your fingers simply because you can't check them easily. They're trapped inside frozen boots, inside frozen armour sabatons, with no way to inspect them without completely dismounting and disarming. You have no idea what's happening to them, but the absence of sensation tells you it's not good. You might already have third-degree frostbite in one or more toes, and you won't know until tonight when you finally remove your boots and discover blackened dead tissue that smells of rot. The nose and ears are particularly vulnerable because they are exposed and have limited blood flow. Your nose right now is probably white or greyish numb and potentially frozen solid. Frostbitten noses sometimes fell off literally detached from the face after particularly severe cold exposure. Medieval art sometimes depicts people with missing noses, and while some of this was from disease, cold injury was a significant cause. You finally make it back to the castle and head to the Great Hall for the midday meal, which medieval people called dinner, the main meal of the day. You're hoping for warmth food, and maybe a few minutes of relief from the constant assault of cold. What you get is a room that's marginally less freezing than outside food that's barely warm, and a social performance that requires energy you don't have. The Great Hall is the castle's central gathering space, and in theory the massive fireplace at one end should heat the entire room. In practice, the fire creates a tiny bubble of warmth, extending perhaps 5 feet in front of the hearth, and everyone else sits in graduated zones of cold. The high table where the lord and his family sit is closest to the fire privilege has its literal warmth. The lower tables where you sit with other household knights are 10 to 15 feet away, which means you're cold. The servants' tables are even farther, which means they're colder. Medieval social hierarchy was enforced by temperature. The fire itself is enormous logs 3 feet long burning in a hearth big enough to walk into, but most of that heat goes straight up the chimney. Medieval fireplace design was terrible at actually heating rooms. They were essentially bonfires indoors, and while they provided light and some warmth, they were incredibly inefficient. Modern calculations suggest that medieval fireplaces captured maybe 10 to 15% of the fire's heat, with the rest escaping up the flue. You're sitting in a cold room with a roaring fire visible, which somehow makes the cold feel more bitter. The food arrives, and it's not hot. The kitchen is in a separate building, a fire safety measure because kitchen fires regularly burn down wooden structures, which means food has to be carried across an open courtyard to reach the hall. By the time dishes reach your table, they've been exposed to freezing temperatures for several minutes. Your stew is lukewarm at best with a skin of congealed fat on top. Your bread is cold. Your ale has ice crystals floating in it. You're supposed to eat with your hands, and a knife forks won't become common for centuries. But your hands are still frozen in their gauntlets, which you're reluctant to remove because you know the pain of rewarming will be excruciating. Some knights eat with their gauntlets on, fumbling with utensils, spilling food, looking ridiculous but staying slightly warmer. Others bite the bullet, remove their gauntlets, and immediately regret it as blood flow returns to damaged fingers, with stabbing, burning pain that makes them gasp. The stew contains root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, onions, and some questionable meat that might be mutton or might be something else entirely. Winter meat is suspicious because animals are typically slaughtered in autumn, and by midwinter you're eating preserved meat that's been salted, smoked or dried months ago. Some of it has gone bad despite preservation efforts, but you eat it anyway because calories are survival. Food poisoning is a risk you take because starvation is a certainty if you refuse food. There's a hierarchy to eating even here. The Lord's table gets the best cuts of meat, the freshest bread, the clearest ale. Your table gets secondary portions, tougher meat, older bread, cloudier ale. The servants get scraps and whatever's left. In winter, when food supplies are limited, this hierarchy becomes deadly serious. Knights occasionally went hungry, while the Lord's table remained fully provisioned because social order mattered more than individual survival. Conversation during the meal is muted. Everyone is too exhausted, too cold, too focused on eating to engage in the jovial banter you see in movies. Medieval feasts were loud, raucous affairs, but those happened in autumn after harvest when food was plentiful and spirits high. Winter meals are grim utilitarian affairs where people mechanically consume whatever's available and hope it's enough to keep them alive another day. You notice several empty seats at your table. Some nights are too ill to attend, laid up with winter ailments that range from simple colds to deadly pneumonia. Others are on duty, manning guard posts or patrols, eating cold rations while exposed to the elements. A few seats are empty because their occupants died, though nobody mentions this. Bodies are stacked in the unheated cellar waiting for spring burial, and life continues because dwelling on death in winter means surrendering to despair. The hall's high ceiling, impressive and grand, means all the heat from people's bodies and the fire rises uselessly above your heads. You can actually see the thermal stratification. Warm air near the ceiling creates a hazy layer, while cold air at floor level makes your legs numb despite sitting down. Medieval people understood this problem and sometimes tried to address it with canopies or curtains, creating smaller enclosed spaces, but the Great Hall's design worked against comfort at every turn. Dogs are everywhere, and this is actually helpful. Medieval hunting dogs, working dogs, and even noble lapdogs congregate around the tables begging for scraps and providing mobile heat sources. Knights often let dogs lie across their feet under the table using the animal's body heat to warm frozen toes. Some men have dogs in their laps, ostensibly petting them, but really just stealing their warmth. This isn't affection, it's survival. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. Just kidding, wrong topic, but the desperate use of animals for warmth is equally pragmatic. After the disappointing meal, you face one of the strangest realities of medieval knighthood in winter: sleeping in your armour. Not full plate usually, but partial armour that keeps you technically ready for combat while also serving as an insurance against freezing to death. This sounds insane to modern ears, but the logic is brutally pragmatic. Metal retains whatever heat you generate, creating a microclimate between your body and the armour, and in a castle with no real heating, that microclimate might be the difference between life and death. The practice varies depending on circumstance and location. Knights on campaign travelling or stationed far from secure castles often slept in most of their armour because enemy attacks could come at any moment. But even knights theoretically safe inside castle walls kept portions of their harness on through winter nights. The most common approach was wearing your cuisses and greaves, your gorget, and sometimes your pauldrons, while removing the breastplate and gauntlets to allow somewhat easier breathing and hand function. The reasoning behind this seems backward until you experience it. Yes, metal is cold. Yes, putting on frozen armour is torture. But once that metal reaches your body temperature, which takes hours and enormous energy expenditure, it holds that heat. The armour becomes a shell that traps your body heat inside, preventing it from radiating into the freezing chamber air. Think of it like a crude, uncomfortable version of a thermos bottle with you as the hot liquid inside. The problem is the initial warming period. When you first lie down in partial armour, you're essentially in a metal refrigerator. The cuisses against your thighs, the greaves against your shins, they're pulling heat from your body at an alarming rate. You shiver violently, your teeth chatter so hard you worry about cracking them, and your muscles tense into painful knots. This warming period can last an hour or more, during which you're burning calories at an extreme rate just to heat the metal touching your body. If you survive the warming period without succumbing to hypothermia, and some men didn't, you reach a fragile equilibrium. The metal is now body temperature, your underlayers have trapped some insulating air, and you're slightly less cold than you would be without the armour. Not warm, never warm, but less cold, which in medieval winter terms counts as success. You lie there in your metal shell, afraid to move because any movement admits cold air and disrupts the careful thermal balance you've achieved. Sleeping in armour creates a host of secondary problems. The weight compresses your body unevenly, restricting blood flow and creating pressure points that become painful after hours. Your legs encased in metal can't move freely, which means you can't shift positions during the night to relieve discomfort. You lie in basically one position for hours, and the resulting stiffness and pain when you wake up is almost worse than the cold itself. The armour also restricts breathing. Even without the breastplate, the gorget around your neck and the weight of leg armour on your chest make deep breathing difficult. You take shallow breaths all night, which means less oxygen, which means poorer sleep quality, which compounds the exhaustion from everything else. Medieval people didn't understand sleep apnea or oxygen deprivation, but they knew that sleeping in armour left you feeling unrested even after a full night's rest. Historians still debate how common this practice really was. Some argue it was rare, limited to active military campaigns. Others point to wardrobe accounts and personal letters mentioning knights lying in harness during winter. The truth probably varies by region, time period, and individual circumstance. But enough evidence exists to confirm that yes, medieval knights sometimes chose to sleep in partial armour because the alternative, sleeping without it in an unheated chamber, was worse. The psychological aspect is perhaps the strangest part. You're lying in bed, supposedly resting, but you're wearing pieces of armour that symbolise combat and death. Your unconscious mind can't fully relax because the armour signals danger readiness warfare. Sleep in these conditions is shallow and fragmented, filled with uneasy dreams of battles and freezing. You wake repeatedly through the night, disoriented, unsure if you're under attack or just cold, and it takes seconds for your frozen brain to process your situation. Some knights try to mitigate the discomfort by padding their armour with additional cloth, wrapping their leg armour in wool strips, or stuffing extra linen between metal and skin. This helped slightly with both cold and pressure points, but it also made the armour less effective if you actually had to fight. A compromise between comfort and readiness, and like most compromises, it satisfied neither need completely. The chambermaid, if you're fortunate enough to have one assigned, brings extra blankets before you sleep. These aren't the soft, fluffy blankets of modern life, they're heavy wool textiles, rough and scratchy smelling of lanolin and damp sheep. Each blanket weighs perhaps 5 to 10 pounds, and you pile them on 3, 4, 5 blankets until you're lying under a weight of 30 or 40 pounds of wool on top of your armoured body. The weight is suffocating, but the pressure helps hold in body heat. Water in winter is a special kind of problem that most people don't think about until they're facing it. You need water to survive, obviously, but every water source in and around the castle is either frozen, solid, contaminated, or requires dangerous effort to access. This isn't a minor inconvenience, it's a daily crisis that kills people through dehydration, disease, or accidents during water collection. The castle well is the primary water source, and in deep winter it's a death trap. The well shaft descends 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet into the ground, and the surface is covered with ice. Someone, usually a servant or unlucky squire, has to break through this ice layer every morning using a heavy iron bar or hammer. The sound of metal striking ice echoes through the courtyard at dawn, a percussive reminder that survival requires constant, violent effort against nature. Once the ice is broken, drawing water becomes treacherous. The well bucket rope and winch mechanism are all coated in ice, making them slippery and difficult to grip. The rope is frozen stiff, resistant to bending, and when you try to lower the bucket, it descends jerkily instead of smoothly. If you lose your grip, and people do, because remember your hands are frozen and potentially frostbitten, the bucket plummets down the shaft, hits bottom with a crash, and you have to fish it out somehow, or lose the castle's water supply. The water that comes up is so cold it hurts to touch. We're not talking cool or chilly, we're talking liquid that's hovering just above freezing temperature, perhaps 33 or 34 degrees Fahrenheit. When you pour this water to drink or wash your hands, go numb immediately from contact. Drinking it is like swallowing ice, creating a cold shock in your stomach that makes you gasp and sometimes vomit. Your body has to expend precious energy warming this water to body temperature, which increases your caloric needs when food is already scarce. But here's the real danger: contaminated water. The well water in winter often contains runoff from the castle's cesspits, latrines, and animal pens. In warmer months, this contamination is diluted by regular water flow and possibly mitigated by filtration through soil. In winter, everything is frozen or stagnant and contamination concentrates. Drinking well water in winter means risking dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and various other waterborne diseases that medieval people didn't understand but definitely experienced. Dysentery in winter is essentially a death sentence. The disease causes severe diarrhea and dehydration, which are manageable in summer when you can drink frequently and your body isn't fighting cold stress. But in winter, when you're already borderline dehydrated, when drinking water is painful and difficult, when your body is conserving every resource for warmth, dysentery quickly becomes fatal. You lose fluids faster than you can replace them, your body temperature drops, and you die from a combination of dehydration and hypothermia. Some castles tried to maintain cisterns, large storage tanks of collected rainwater, but these froze solid in winter. The ice in a cistern could be 2 or 3 feet thick, rendering the entire water supply inaccessible without massive effort to chip through. Some castles just abandoned their cisterns in winter and relied entirely on wells, accepting the contamination risk because alternatives were worse. Rivers and streams were theoretically another water source, but accessing them in winter meant leaving the castle's relative safety travelling to the water source through snow and ice, breaking through frozen surfaces and hauling heavy water containers back uphill to the castle. This job typically fell to the lowest-ranking servants, and they died doing it. Falling through thin ice into freezing water while carrying heavy buckets meant drowning, hypothermia, or both. Medieval records casually mention servants lost to the river, during winter a euphemism for frozen corpses found downstream in spring. The water you do obtain is rationed carefully. Drinking water takes priority, obviously, but washing water is scarce to non-existent. Medieval people in winter simply didn't wash regularly. No baths heating enough water for a bath would require burning enormous amounts of precious firewood. No hand washing before meals, minimal face washing. You're living in a state of constant filth, and the cold actually helps by reducing bacterial growth and masking odours. This lack of hygiene contributed to disease spread, creating another deadly feedback loop. Contaminated hands spread illness, which weakens people, which makes them more vulnerable to cold, which kills them. The castle becomes a petri dish of disease during winter, with dysentery, typhoid, flu, and pneumonia circulating constantly through the population. Modern historians examining medieval mortality records see clear spikes in winter deaths, and contaminated water was likely a major contributor. Some knights tried to avoid the water problem by drinking only ale wine or other fermented beverages. The alcohol and fermentation process killed some bacteria, making these drinks safer than water. But this created its own issues: chronic mild dehydration from alcohol consumption, malnutrition from replacing water with empty calories, and in severe cases, alcohol dependence. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew drinking only ale was problematic, but they also knew that ale was less likely to kill you than water, so they chose the lesser evil. Your personal water ration might be a quart or two per day, if you're lucky enough to drink, but nothing extra. You sip it slowly, making it last, knowing the next ration isn't guaranteed. Your lips are cracked and bleeding from dehydration and cold. Your mouth is constantly dry. Your urine is dark and concentrated, a clear sign of dehydration that medieval physicians would have recognized as a bad humor imbalance and treated with bloodletting, which obviously made dehydration worse. By late afternoon, you're discovering another brutal truth about winter knighthood. Your hands have stopped working. Not just numb with covered numbness, but actually non-functional. The frostbite damage from earlier combined with hours of cold exposure has destroyed your fine motor control. You literally cannot grip your sword properly, cannot hold reins with precision, cannot perform any of the skilled tasks that define your role as a knight. Try to make a fist. Your fingers respond slowly, partially incorrectly. The signal from your brain reaches your hand, but the muscles don't obey properly. This is nerve damage from repeated cold exposure combined with muscle stiffness from hypothermia combined with simple exhaustion. Your fingers curl into a loose claw shape instead of a proper fist, and forcing them to close completely requires conscious effort and causes sharp pain. Pick up your sword. The grip that should be automatic muscle memory from thousands of hours of training now requires careful thought. You wrap your fingers around the handle, but you can't feel the texture of the leather wrapping. You can't sense how tightly you're gripping. When you lift the sword, it feels heavier than usual because your weakened hands can't support the weight efficiently. The blade wavers in the air, and you know that in actual combat, this wavering would get you killed. The scariest part is the delayed response time. You tell your hand to do something, and there's a perceptible lag, half a second, maybe a full second before your hand obeys. In combat, where reactions need to be instantaneous, this delay is fatal. An enemy strikes you, see it coming, your brain commands your hand to parry, but your hand moves too slowly and the blow lands. This is how knights died in winter combat, not from lack of skill, but from bodies that couldn't execute what their minds commanded. Some knights lost grip strength permanently after particularly harsh winters. The combination of frostbite nerve damage and muscle atrophy meant that when spring arrived and warmth returned, their hands never fully recovered. Medieval armories contain records of knights who could no longer wield standard weapons and had to commission specially modified grips, lighter blades, or different fighting styles to compensate for damaged hands. Your ability to hold reins is equally compromised. Riding requires constant, subtle adjustments, slight pressure here, gentle release there, maintaining just enough contact to communicate with your horse without restricting it. All of this requires functional hands with sensory feedback. When you can't feel the reins, when your grip is weak and unresponsive, riding becomes dangerous. Your horse senses your impaired control and becomes nervous, which makes the animal harder to manage, which requires better hand control that you don't have. The gauntlets that were supposed to protect your hands have become part of the problem. The metal has conducted cold directly into your fingers for hours. The leather lining is frozen stiff, and removing them now after they've partially warmed means facing excruciating rewarming pain. But keeping them on means continuing to lose dexterity. Choose between pain or uselessness. Another delightful medieval decision. Historians still argue whether medieval knights understood the long-term damage they were causing to their hands. Some evidence suggests they knew that repeated winter exposure led to permanent problems. Letters mention knights retiring from active service due to disorders of the extremities or weakened grip. Other evidence suggests they just accepted hand damage as an inevitable part of the profession, like modern athletes accepting that their bodies will be destroyed by their sport. Buckles, straps and clasps become impossible to manipulate. Your armour is held together by dozens of small fasteners that require precision finger movements, and you can't manage them. Your squire has to help with everything, but his hands are just as damaged as yours. You watch him fumble with a simple buckle for 30 seconds, his frozen fingers slipping repeatedly. And you both know this is absurd, but neither can do better. Writing is completely impossible. Not that you were probably literate anyway, most knights weren't, but for those who could read and write, winter meant months of inability to perform these tasks. Medieval scribes and clerks suffered especially from hand problems, their profession requiring precise finger movements that cold made impossible. Some medieval manuscripts show quality degradation during winter months with shakier handwriting and more errors, clear evidence of cold-damaged hands attempting delicate work. The psychological impact of losing manual dexterity is profound. Your hands define your competence as a knight. They wield weapons, control horses, manipulate equipment. When your hands fail, your identity fails. Some knights developed intense anxiety about their hands, constantly checking them, trying to warm them, obsessing over every sign of damage. This anxiety was rational. Your hands were literally your livelihood, and losing them meant losing everything. Some attempted treatments were worse than the problem. Rubbing hands with snow, plunging them into near boiling water, wrapping them in animal fat and cloth, all medieval remedies that caused additional damage. The concept of gradual, gentle rewarming wouldn't be understood for centuries. Medieval physicians recommended vigorous massage and extreme temperature changes, which sounds horrible, because it was horrible, often causing permanent damage to nerves and blood vessels already compromised by cold. Evening brings the possibility of combat because enemies are just as desperate and miserable as you are, and desperation makes people dangerous. Winter raids are a grim reality of medieval warfare. Small groups attacking isolated targets seeking supplies, warmth and plunder. Your castle might be raided by bandits, rival lords' forces, or even your own lord's enemies. And you, exhausted and frozen, are expected to defend against these attacks. The warning comes as a horn blast from the battlements. 2 short blows meaning armed force approaching. Your body, which was finally settling into a state of minimal suffering by the fire, now has to mobilize. You struggle to your feet, joints protesting, muscles cramping, and rush to arm yourself fully. Remember how long it took to put on armor this morning. You need to do it again, faster, while your hands barely function and your body screams for rest. Your squire helps frantically, but the process still takes precious minutes. Minutes during which the enemy's getting closer, during which you should already be in position. You're pulling on frozen sabatons, buckling frozen cuisses, settling frozen pauldrons onto your shoulders, and every second feels like an eternity. Other knights around you are doing the same panicked dance, and you can hear officers shouting for speed, for readiness for the impossible. You grab your sword and rush to the walls, climbing those spiral staircases in full armour, while your legs burn and your lungs scream. The stairs seem endless, each step a separate battle against exhaustion and weight. You reach the battlements, gasping your vision, swimming, your heart pounding so hard you worry it might simply stop. And now you're supposed to fight. The enemy is visible below, maybe 20 mounted raiders, maybe more in the darkness and snow. They're probing the castle's defences, looking for weaknesses, testing whether the garrison is alert and functional. In summer, this would be a minor threat, easily repelled. In winter, this could be catastrophic because the defenders are as frozen and weak as you are. Archers on the walls try to loose arrows, but their bowstrings are frozen stiff. Their fingers can't draw properly, and their aim is wild. An arrow that would hit a man-sized target at 100 yards in summer now misses by 10 feet because the archer's hands are shaking with cold, and his muscles won't respond correctly. The enemy knows this. They're counting on winter making the defenders ineffective. Someone shouts for boiling oil to pour on the attackers, but the oil isn't boiling, it's barely warm, because keeping massive quantities of oil hot requires constant fire, and fuel is too precious to maintain defensive measures that might not be needed. What they pour is lukewarm oil that splashes on the raiders below without causing serious harm. The psychological effect is there, but the actual damage is minimal. Medieval defences relied on heat as a weapon, but winter neutralises that advantage. You're supposed to be watching the enemy, tracking their movements, preparing for escalation. But your eyes are freezing shut again. Tears and moisture forming ice crystals on your lashes. You wipe frantically at your face, clearing your vision just in time to see a grappling hook sail over the battlement and catch on the stone. Someone is climbing. This just became a real fight. The first raider appears at the wall edge, and you move to engage, but you're moving through molasses. Your body won't respond with combat speed. Your sword comes up in what should be a fluid motion, but instead is a jerky, slow arc that gives the enemy time to react. He parries easily, and suddenly you're in actual sword-to-sword combat while wearing frozen armour with frozen hands on a frozen wall top that's maybe 3 feet wide with a 60-foot drop on one side. Every training instinct you have is betrayed by your cold-impaired body. You know the correct responses, the proper forms, the right techniques. Your brain is screaming instructions that your muscles simply cannot execute. He strikes you. Attempt to parry your numb hands, don't adjust grip properly, and his blade slides past your defense. Only your breastplate saves you. The strike hits metal instead of flesh, and the clang reverberates through your chest. You counterattack clumsily, and by pure luck, more than skill, you catch him across the forearm. His own cold-impaired armour fails to protect him completely, and he stumbles backward, losing his footing on the icy stone and falls. You don't see him land, but you hear the impact and the scream. One threat eliminated not through your prowess as a knight, but through mutual exhaustion and incapacity. More raiders are climbing. Your fellow defenders are engaging them, and the sounds of combat on the frozen battlements create a strange symphony. Metal on metal grunts of effort, screams of pain, and underneath it all the howl of wind that never stops. This is combat stripped of glory, reduced to exhausted people hitting each other with metal sticks while trying not to fall off walls. The fight lasts perhaps 20 minutes before the raiders withdraw. They came seeking easy plunder and found defenders just functional enough to make the effort too costly. They retreat into the darkness, leaving behind 2 dead raiders and 3 wounded on the walls. Your side has casualties too. 1 defender fell off the wall, another took a sword thrust through a gap in his armour, a third is unconscious from a blow to his helmet. After the raid, you're taken to see the castle physician, because you took that hit to your breastplate and you're having trouble breathing. Medieval medicine in winter combines ancient theory folk remedies, religious faith and practices that make modern people wince. The physician's chamber is one of the few heated rooms in the castle, not because of compassion, but because his medicines and instruments need to be kept from freezing. The physician is an educated man trained in the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health means these humours are balanced. Illness means they're out of balance. Your symptoms: difficulty breathing, chest pain. Extreme fatigue he interprets as an excess of phlegm and cold humours, brought on by winter's dominance. His treatment will address this imbalance using methods that are hundreds of years old and spectacularly misguided. First, he wants to examine your frostbitten fingers, which have turned an alarming greyish-white colour with dark spots appearing at the tips. He looks at them, nods sagely, and announces that the cold humours have invaded your extremities and must be expelled through heat. He orders a brazier brought close and instructs you to hold your hands near the hot coals. You know from experience that this will be agonising. And you're right. The sudden heat on frozen tissue creates pain so intense you nearly vomit. He's satisfied with your screaming interpreting it as the cold humours being driven out. In reality, the rapid rewarming is causing additional tissue damage, bursting cells that were barely surviving and ensuring that some of your fingertips will eventually turn black and fall off. But medieval medical theory doesn't understand cellular damaged tissue necrosis or proper frostbite treatment. They just know that frozen flesh needs heat, and more heat must be better. Next comes bloodletting for your breathing difficulties. The theory is that your blood has become too thick and cold, creating blockages that prevent proper breathing. The physician produces a small knife called a phleem and makes careful cuts in the vein on your inner elbow. Your blood, sluggish from cold, flows slowly into a bowl. He takes perhaps 8 ounces, maybe more, watching the colour and consistency and nodding as if the blood itself is speaking to him. This bloodletting has just made everything worse. You're already borderline anemic from poor winter nutrition, already dehydrated from limited water access, already exhausted from constant cold stress. Removing blood, the fluid that carries oxygen and heat throughout your body, further compromises your ability to function. But you'll feel slightly better temporarily, because the body releases endorphins in response to blood loss, and the physician will interpret this as proof his treatment worked. For your chest injury, he prepares a poultice of heated herbs, garlic, mustard, onion, and various plants whose names you don't recognise. This mixture is heated until it's almost burning hot, then slapped directly onto your bruised chest. The heat penetrates through your skin, and while it does provide some pain relief through warmth and possibly mild antibacterial action from the garlic, it also burns your skin and will leave blisters. Medieval people didn't distinguish between therapeutic warmth and damaging heat. They just knew hot poultices helped with pain. Historians still debate how effective medieval medicine actually was. Some treatments were genuinely helpful. Willowbark tea contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Honey has antibacterial properties. Some herbal remedies did provide relief, but many treatments were neutral at best or actively harmful at worst. The problem is that medieval physicians couldn't tell the difference because they didn't have the scientific method or any understanding of how the body actually worked. The physician gives you a drink hot wine mixed with herbs and spices. This is perhaps the most effective treatment you'll receive. The alcohol provides calories and mild pain relief, the heat warms you from the inside, and some of the herbs might have beneficial properties. Mulled wine was a standard medieval remedy for cold weather ailments, and it actually helped, though probably not for the reasons physicians thought. He also performs cupping, placing heated glass cups on your back that create suction as they cool. This is supposed to draw out bad humours and improve blood flow. It does create temporary increased blood flow to the area through the suction, which might provide minor benefits, but mostly it just leaves circular bruises all over your back. Medieval medical texts show elaborate diagrams of cupping points treating it as a precise science, when it was really just ritualized bruising. For your frostbite, once he's finished with the heat torture, he applies a salve made from animal fat mixed with herbs. This is actually somewhat helpful. The fat creates a moisture barrier that prevents further drying and cracking, and some of the herbs have mild antiseptic properties. But he also wraps your fingers tightly in cloth, which restricts circulation to already damaged tissue, ensuring worse outcomes. Medieval bandaging technique often caused more harm than the original injury. The physician confidently predicts your recovery based on astrological calculations. He checks what phase the moon is in, considers your birth date, and consults a chart showing favourable and unfavourable days for healing. None of this has any basis in reality, but it provides psychological comfort. Studies of placebo effect show that believing a treatment will work can actually improve outcomes slightly, so perhaps his confident prediction helps, despite being based on astrology. Evening finally arrives, bringing the false promise of rest. You retreat to your chamber as darkness falls completely, which happens horrifyingly early in winter, perhaps 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That means you're facing 12 to 14 hours of darkness, and darkness in a medieval castle isn't like modern darkness where you flip a switch. This is absolute consuming darkness, broken only by candles you can barely afford to burn. Candles are expensive. A tallow candle made from rendered animal fat costs perhaps a day's wages for a common labourer, and even as a knight you can't afford to burn them freely. Tallow candles smell terrible when burning, producing a thick greasy smoke that makes your eyes water and leaves a film of fat on every surface. They also provide minimal light roughly equivalent to a modern 5-watt bulb, which means you can barely see beyond a few feet. Wax candles made from beeswax are far superior cleaner, burning better light, pleasant honey smell, but they cost perhaps 10 times as much as tallow candles. These are reserved for churches and the very wealthy. As a household knight, you get tallow candles rationed carefully, and you're expected to make them last. Many nights you simply sit in darkness rather than waste a candle because darkness is free and light is precious. You light a single candle and place it on the small table in your chamber. The flickering light creates shadows that dance on the stone walls, and you realize the walls themselves are crying moisture from your breath, and the minimal temperature difference between inside and outside has condensed on the stone and frozen into elaborate ice patterns. The walls are coated in frost inside your room, creating bizarre crystalline formations that are beautiful and horrifying simultaneously. Your bed is a wooden frame with a rope lattice supporting a thin straw mattress. The mattress is frozen stiff where moisture has accumulated, and lying on it will be like lying on a slightly padded stone slab. You have your blankets, those heavy wool coverings we discussed earlier, but you know from experience that the first hour in bed will be agony as you wait for your body heat to warm the immediate space around you. Some nights sleep with heated stones rocks that were placed near the fire for hours, then wrapped in cloth and brought to bed as primitive heating devices. But heated stones cool within an hour or two, leaving you with cold rocks in your bed that make things worse. Plus, getting stones hot enough requires privileged access to the Great Hall's fire, which you might not have. So most nights you just endure the cold using your body's energy to slowly warm your immediate environment while losing that heat through the stone walls, floor and ceiling. You change out of your armour with your squire's help, and the process of removing frozen metal reveals the damage underneath. Your gambeson, the padded jacket under the armour, is soaked with sweat that has frozen into icy patches. Your linen shirt is damp and cold. Your skin, where it was in contact with a metal or damp fabric, shows red welts and possible early-stage frostbite. You're standing in your freezing chamber, essentially naked, more vulnerable than you've been all day. Dressing for sleep means putting on a nightshirt, a long linen garment that provides minimal warmth, but at least covers your body. Some nights sleep in wool clothing, but wool holds moisture and can make you colder if you sweat during the night. Linen is traditional for sleeping because it's relatively dry, but in winter, linen provides almost no insulation. You're essentially wearing a sheet and hoping your blankets make up the difference. The chamber pot in the corner, you'll remember it froze solid last night, needs to be used before sleep, because getting out of bed in the middle of the night is dangerous. The stone floor is coated in ice, and walking barefoot risks severe frostbite within seconds. but using the chamber pot means exposing yourself to freezing air, and the process is so unpleasant that many men try to avoid it, holding their bladders until morning and risking urinary problems. You blow out the candle to conserve it, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The darkness is so complete you can hold your hand an inch from your face and see nothing. This darkness is disorienting, claustrophobic, and if you had any tendency toward anxiety, this would trigger it. Medieval people were used to darkness in a way modern people can't comprehend. They spent perhaps half their lives in complete darkness, navigating by memory and touch. Before sleep, there's the matter of prayer. Medieval Christianity emphasized evening prayers asking for protection through the night and mercy if death should come before morning. This wasn't mere ritual. Winter nights genuinely did kill people in their sleep, and going to bed without spiritual preparation was considered dangerous. You kneel beside your bed on the frozen rushes and recite prayers you've known since childhood, your breath freezing in the air above you. The prayers are also practical. They slow your breathing, calm your mind, and prepare your body for sleep. Modern sleep science would recognize this as a beneficial bedtime routine, though medieval people understood it as spiritual preparation. Either way, the rhythm of familiar prayers in darkness provides comfort when physical comfort is impossible. The night watch is the shift that kills more nights than any battle ever will, and tonight, despite your exhaustion and injuries, you've been assigned to it. Standing guard through the frozen night from midnight until dawn is a duty that's rotated among the garrison, and when your turn comes, there's no escape. Refusing guard duty is desertion, punishable by execution, so you drag yourself from your bed after perhaps 3 hours of fitful sleep and prepare to spend the darkest, coldest hours of the night standing motionless on the battlements. The watch begins at midnight, marked by the church bell tolling 12 times. You climb to your assigned post on the castle walls, a section of battlement, perhaps 20 feet long, that you're responsible for observing. The climb itself nearly finishes you those spiral stairs in full darkness, in partial armour, because you're too exhausted to don full harness with legs that barely function. Other guards are climbing to their posts, two silent shapes in darkness, and nobody speaks, because speech requires energy nobody has. Your post is exposed to wind from 3 directions. The battlements have crenellations, those distinctive up and down notches in the wall that are supposed to provide cover, but they also funnel wind directly at you. The stone of the walls radiates cold like a malevolent presence, and within minutes of reaching your post, you're colder than you've been all day because you're standing still. Movement generates heat. Stillness allows cold to penetrate completely. You're supposed to watch for threats, enemy forces approaching, fires in the distance, unusual activity in the surrounding countryside. But watching requires keeping your eyes open, and your eyelids are freezing shut again. You blink constantly, wipe your eyes with frozen hands, force them open, and still your vision blurs with ice crystals. In darkness this complete, you can't see more than perhaps 50 feet anyway, which makes the entire exercise of watching somewhat absurd. The cold attacks in waves. First hour you're miserable but functional. Second hour your legs start going numb. Third hour you can't feel your feet at all, and you're shifting weight constantly to maintain circulation, but the shifting barely helps. Fourth hour, around 3 in the morning, the coldest part of night, your body begins shutting down. Your consciousness wavers and you catch yourself nodding off while standing up, which would be funny if it wasn't lethal. Falling asleep on watch is a death sentence in 2 ways. You'll be executed if caught, but more immediately you'll freeze to death where you stand. It happens regularly. Guards are found in the morning, still at their post, frozen solid in standing positions, their eyes open, their hands gripping their spears or swords. The body sometimes freezes so quickly that the person doesn't even fall over, they just become a statue, and the castle has to wait for a thaw to remove them. The wind at this height is murderous. At ground level, buildings and walls provide some shelter, But on the battlements, you're fully exposed to wind that's shrieking across open countryside at 30 or 40 miles per hour. The wind chill at this height in this wind, with air temperatures already below freezing, creates conditions that would register as life-threatening on any modern weather service. Exposure would be measured in minutes, not hours, yet you're expected to stand here for 6 hours. Some guards tie themselves to the walls with a rope, ensuring that if they lose consciousness, they won't fall off the 60-foot drop to the courtyard below. This is simultaneously wise and horrifying. Wise because it prevents falling deaths, horrifying because it means you might freeze to death while suspended by rope, unable to collapse your body held upright by the tether even after death. Finding a frozen guard hanging by his safety rope is a grim morning discovery. You try to stay alert by moving small movements, shifting weight-flexing muscles, but movement requires energy that you don't have. Each movement burns calories your body desperately needs for heat generation. There's a terrible calculation happening. Move to stay alert and generate heat, but burn energy you can't replace, or stay still to conserve energy, but risk freezing or falling asleep. There's no winning option. Hallucinations begin around hour 4. Sleep deprivation, hypothermia, and sensory deprivation combine to make your brain misfire. You see movement, where there is none enemy forces appearing in the darkness, only to vanish when you blink. You hear voices calling your name, but when you turn there's nobody there. Medieval guards attributed these experiences to demons or evil spirits testing their faith. Modern medicine recognizes them as symptoms of severe hypothermia affecting brain function. The sergeant of the watch is supposed to make rounds checking on guards, ensuring everyone is alert and alive. But he's just as cold and exhausted as you are, and his rounds become perfunctory, a quick glance from a distance to confirm you're upright and moving. If you are frozen dead in a standing position, he might not notice until dawn revealed your corpse. Dawn finally comes, revealing a truth that would destroy any romantic notions about knightly honour and medieval valour knights deserted in winter. Not occasionally, not rarely, but constantly. Men abandoned their oaths, their lords, their duties, and fled south toward warmer climates because winter duty was simply unsurvivable. And the punishments for desertion, brutal as they were, couldn't stop the steady hemorrhaging of manpower every winter brought. The mathematics of desertion were grimly logical. Stay at your post through winter, and you had perhaps a 50-50 chance of surviving until spring. Your odds of permanent injury, lost fingers, lost toes, chronic illness were nearly certain. The pay was often months in arrears because lords struggled financially in winter when agricultural income stopped. Your family, if you had one, might be starving back home. Against this, desertion offered the possibility of survival warmth and escape from slow death by freezing. Some knights fled to southern territories, Italy, southern France, Iberia, where winter was milder and employment opportunities existed. Medieval warfare was seasonal in the south, with campaigns continuing through winter months, so a deserter could find work with a new lord who didn't ask too many questions about previous service. The code of chivalry theoretically made oath-breaking shameful, but in practice, many southern lords welcomed experienced northern knights regardless of their reasons for travelling. Others simply went home. A knight with family lands or a small estate would abandon his post and return to his own holdings, reasoning that protecting his own family and property outweighed obligations to a lord who couldn't provide basic survival necessities. Medieval records show numerous cases of knights departing without leave during winter, with some returning in spring and others never seen again. The punishments for court deserters were designed to terrify others into staying. Execution was standard hanging, beheading, or being drawn and quartered depending on the lord's mood and the severity of the offence. But executions had to be public to serve as deterrent, and public executions in winter created logistical problems. Frozen ground made digging graves difficult. Crowds were smaller because people avoided gathering in cold, and the overall misery of winter reduced the psychological impact of the spectacle. Some lords tried alternative deterrents, branding deserters so they could never hide their shame, cutting off hands so they could never serve as knights again, or imprisoning them in castle dungeons that were basically frozen tombs. But every harsh punishment had to be weighed against the reality that killing or permanently disabling your own knights weakened your military capacity when you could least afford weakness. The most effective deterrent wasn't punishment, but the knowledge that desertion in winter was itself dangerous. Travelling in winter meant exposure to elements without shelter, risk of robbery by desperate bandits, potential death from freezing before reaching safety. Many would-be deserters died attempting escape, their bodies found frozen along roadways in spring. In some perverse way, winter itself enforced loyalty by making abandonment nearly as deadly as staying. Historians still debate the actual desertion rates because medieval records are incomplete and biased. Lords didn't want to document high desertion rates because it reflected poorly on their leadership and control. Many deaths recorded in winter were probably desertions that couldn't be proven. Some estimates suggest that northern castles lost 10 to 20% of their garrison every winter through a combination of death, desertion, and incapacitation. The psychological impact on those who stayed was corrosive. Watching comrades disappear, knowing they'd chosen desertion over loyalty, created resentment and distrust. Why should you suffer when others escaped? What made you stay when flight was an option? The answers, honour, duty, fear, lack of alternatives felt increasingly hollow as winter dragged on and more men vanished. Some lords tried to prevent desertion through positive incentives rather than threats. Bonus payments for winter service, better food rations, promises of spring rewards, these sometimes helped reduce desertion rates. But most lords couldn't afford such incentives, and their garrisons simply dissolved gradually through the winter, leaving castles undermanned and vulnerable when spring campaigns began. You've thought about desertion. Of course you have. Every knight in winter has calculated whether escape is possible, whether the risks of flight outweigh the certainty of continued suffering. You haven't fled yet. Maybe because of genuine loyalty. Maybe because you have nowhere better to go. Maybe because you're too exhausted to organise an escape. But the thought persists, gnawing at your mind during the coldest nights. Why am I still here? The castle around you shows evidence of desertion's impact. Guard posts are consolidated because there aren't enough men to cover all positions. Patrols are reduced or cancelled entirely. Training has become sporadic because the training master lost half his students to death or desertion. The Lord increasingly relies on his household knights, men like you, who have personal obligations beyond simple employment because mercenaries and hired soldiers disappeared weeks ago. In spring, assuming you survive, there will be a reckoning. Some deserters will return with excuses and beg forgiveness. Some will be hunted down and executed as examples. Others will have vanished completely, starting new lives under assumed names in distant territories. And new knights will arrive to replace the losses, young men who haven't experienced medieval winter yet, who still believe in glory and honour, who don't yet understand that winter is the real enemy, and survival is the only victory that matters. You make it through one more night, but morning doesn't bring relief. It brings the discovery that you might not make it through another. Your body has reached its limit, pushed beyond what human physiology can endure. When you try to rise from your bed, your legs won't cooperate. They're not just stiff or painful, they're fundamentally non-responsive, as if the connection between your brain and your limbs has been severed by cold. This is how most medieval knights died in winter, not in glorious combat, not from dramatic injuries, but simply by not waking up one morning. or waking up but being too damaged to continue. Your core temperature has dropped below the point where your body can maintain essential functions. Your heart is beating irregularly, struggling to pump blood that's become thick and sluggish. Your breathing is shallow because your chest muscles are too cold to expand your lungs properly. You're dying by degrees, and the process is almost peaceful in its quiet inevitability. Your squire finds you still in bed well past dawn and immediately recognizes the signs. He's seen this before. Everyone has seen this before. He doesn't panic or call for help immediately. Instead, he makes a quick assessment. Are you conscious and responsive, or have you slipped beyond recovery? You manage to speak, which means there's still hope, and he rushes to summon help. They carry you to the great hall and place you directly in front of the fire, the closest position reserved for the dying or the near dead. The heat that should feel wonderful instead causes agony as frozen tissue begins to re-warm. Your fingers and toes, already damaged from frostbite, now scream with pain as blood flow partially returns. The rewarming pain is worse than any battle injury you've experienced, a burning, stabbing, throbbing sensation that makes you cry out involuntarily. The castle's residents understand what's happening. Most winter deaths occur in stages first, the warning signs: extreme exhaustion, confusion, inability to warm up. Then the crisis point where the body shuts down, then either recovery or death within a day or two. You've reached the crisis point, and whether you survive depends on factors beyond anyone's control: how much damage your body has sustained, whether infection sets in, whether your heart can restart its normal rhythm. They give you warm wine, forcing it between your lips even as you struggle to swallow. The liquid is life itself, providing calories and heat simultaneously. Someone has brought heated stones wrapped in cloth, pressing them against your body's core, your abdomen and chest, trying to warm you from the outside while the wine works from inside. The stones are nearly burning hot, but your frozen body absorbs the heat desperately. Your vision fades in and out. You're experiencing the final stages of hypothermia, where the body makes last desperate attempts to survive. Your brain is oxygen deprived, your organs are failing, and consciousness becomes optional. You drift between awareness and absence, and in these moments of clarity you understand that this is how it ends for most nights, not in glory but in exhaustion and cold. The priest arrives to perform last rites, which tells you everything about your prognosis. He anoints you with oil, speaks prayers you barely hear, and prepares your soul for death. This is routine for him. He performs these rites multiple times, each winter, sometimes multiple times per week. The prayers are beautiful in their way, speaking of eternal warmth and peace of a heaven where cold doesn't exist and suffering ends. Whether you believe the theology or not, the ritual provides structure to dying. Some men recover from this point. Their bodies, given warmth and rest and minimal nutrition, somehow restart essential functions. These survivors often lose fingers or toes to frostbite necrosis, and they're never quite the same, chronically sensitive to cold, easily exhausted, prone to illness. But they live, which in medieval winter is the only achievement that matters. Others decline gradually over days. Their bodies, too damaged to repair themselves, simply shut down system by system. First the extremities, fingers and toes turning black with gangrene. Then the organs, kidneys, failing liver, struggling heart beating irregularly. Finally the brain consciousness fading as oxygen deprivation causes irreversible damage. Death comes quietly, often during sleep, and the body is added to the winter's toll. You drift in the space between these outcomes, your body making calculations you can't influence. Medieval people believed God decided who lived and died, and from their perspective that was true. There was nothing medicine could do at this point. Modern medicine would recognize severe hypothermia, complicated by frostbite, dehydration, malnutrition, and probably pneumonia. The treatment would involve heated IV fluids, controlled rewarming antibiotics, and intensive care. You get warm wine and prayers. The hall around you continues functioning because it must. Other knights are preparing for the day's duties, servants are clearing breakfast. Life proceeds because stopping would mean everyone dies. Your situation is unfortunate, but not unexpected. Every winter claims its share of knights and replacements will arrive in spring. This is the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare. Individuals are expendable, the system continues. Your last coherent thought before consciousness fades again is surprise that you made it this far. One day felt impossible, yet you survived dawn morning duties, patrol combat guard duty, and nearly to the next dawn. That's further than many made it. Whether you survived to see actual spring months away still is unknown. But you lasted one day in conditions designed to kill you, which makes you either incredibly resilient or incredibly stubborn. In medieval winter, those qualities were identical. The fire continues to burn. Others will take your place on tomorrow's patrol, will stand, tomorrow's watch will face tomorrow's frozen dawn. The castle endures because it must. Winter passes because it always does eventually. And those who survive damage diminished, but alive will tell themselves it was worth it. They'll tell themselves that duty and honour matter more than comfort. They'll tell themselves they'd do it again. And they'll be lying, but lies sometimes keep you warmer than truth. The cold wind outside doesn't care about knights or castles, duty or desertion. It simply blows as it has for millennia, indifferent to human suffering. The stone walls stand firm against it, providing the illusion of shelter while offering only the reality of slower death. And in this space between protection and exposure, medieval knights existed, not heroes, not villains, just people trying desperately to survive one more frozen day in a world that gave them metal armor instead of warmth, honor instead of comfort, and death instead of glory. The story ends here. The winter continues as it always does until it doesn't. Spring will come eventually, bringing thaw and relief and new problems to replace the old ones. But for now, there is only cold and endurance, and the quiet knowledge that most people throughout history lived and died in conditions modern humans would find unimaginable. They weren't stronger or braver, they simply had no choice but to endure or die. And most of them eventually died. Sleep well knowing that your bed is warm, your water is clean, and winter is just weather, not warfare. Good night. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.